My name is Tim, I'm an alcoholic. One thing you need to be aware of with these workshops, it's a bit like a brand tub. You never know exactly when you stick your hand in what you're going to get out. Now, if you come in August, you'll get someone, I think, with a PhD who's written a book and he's a fellow of this and a director of that. I'm none of those things. I haven't written a book. I haven't got a PhD. I'm not a fellow of this or a director of that. So feel free to leave now and wait for the real experts to come along in August. Um, my only qualification for being here is being an alcoholic who's been in AA for 29 years. And what we're going to be talking about, or what I'm going to be talking about, is the traditions in relationships. Clancy always tells the story about the moment that a sponsor's heart sinks. It's where your sponsee phones you up and says, I'm in a relationship. I need some advice. If you've ever sponsored people, your heart will have sunk at that point as well, for lots of different reasons. Now, the big book has got plenty of material on relationships, but the traditions are an excellent guide for relationships. The 12 concepts are useful too. What they're good on is getting work done with other people in recovery in the service area, and you can apply it outside recovery as well. But getting work done in the service structure in a way which is effective, efficient, and harmonious. The traditions are a mixed bag. They're partly about how the group operates internally. They're partly about how groups relate to each other, and they're partly about how the fellowship operates internally, and then they're finally about how the fellowship relates to the outside world, and there are a few principles which are thrown into the mix as well. So the traditions, they're really a bag of principles that were hammered out in the first 20 years or so that AA was in existence. And they're built on mistakes which had devastating consequences for groups. That's where they came from. They weren't sucked out of Bill W.'s fingers. They were constructed based on cold, hard experience of what worked and what didn't work. Now, the notion of taking the traditions and the concepts to apply them in other areas is not new. There are various people who've done that over the years. There's a Texan Al-Anon tradition of doing that, and more generally in Al-Anon now, the traditions and concepts, for those who are diligent enough, which is quite a qualification, can be applied in all sorts of different areas and are regularly studied in Al-Anon, far more than in AA, my observation. So my home group, the concepts get read out on a regular basis. The traditions are studied every single week. In AA, everyone groans when it gets to the traditions, and also the Al-Anon literature overtly talks about applying the principles and the traditions and the concepts in other areas. The AA literature doesn't, not in any broad sense. So occasionally there are little nudges in that direction. There's a chap called Dennis F., who I think he's still sober. He got sober in the early 70s, who wrote a series of essays, I think around 30 years ago, maybe 40 years ago now, about the steps, the traditions and the concept, how they can be applied in AA within the home and within outside settings as well. They're very useful. I think there are a couple of people here who've got the links to the Dennis F. materials. If they could post those during the talk, that will be very, very helpful. But I'm going to talk specifically about the traditions in relationships. And the example I'm going to give is, I'm going to be a bit naughty now. You know when you go and see a therapist about your marriage, you're not allowed to ask them if they're married. They start to become very vague. Or so, well, I'm sure some do, but ones I went to, you ask them a personal question, you get a very gruff response. It all gets turned around with something like, well, what difference would it make were I married? And they focus it back on. You're not allowed to ask. You're not allowed to say to your therapist, are you happy? Is what you're feeding me, how's it working for you? You don't get to ask that with most of them. In AA, it's a little bit different. You've got to put your money where your mouth is. So in as far as I can be qualified to talk about the traditions in the relationships, well, first of all, I do apply them. That's one qualification. Secondly, I'm married. I've been with someone for 18 years. And we don't argue. And not only do we not argue, we don't need to argue. We don't have anything to argue about. Now, I can bang on about how happy we are, but I think those two facts probably are sufficient to speak for themselves. We get on very well. Everything works very, very smoothly within the household. I was in a relationship with someone else in AA for 8 years before that. This is now 18 years with someone who is not in AA. So I'm going to go through this in a linear way, tradition by tradition. So tradition 1, I'm going to read out the tradition, say how I apply it in our relationship. My other half, by the way, this is the funny thing about the traditions. They look like magic to us. They look like information that's come from another galaxy. To people who are healthy, they are common sense. So my other half naturally applies all of these traditions without having had to have been told about it. In fact, I've learned more about the traditions from him just naturally applying the principles contained within them than I ever have from hearing people bang on about them. So a lot of what you're going to hear, his ears will be burning throughout this, I'm sure. So tradition 1, our common welfare should come first. Personal recovery depends upon AA unity. If you're in a lifeboat, the last thing you want to do is shoot holes in the bottom of the lifeboat. So I think if the relationship has an unwritten rule, it's this. We don't attack each other. We don't criticize each other. And we don't argue. It's those 3 things. We don't attack, we don't criticize, we don't argue. If you want to maintain unity, avoid those 3 things. When we've been together, so I'm not the virtuous one here, I'm the one that was a slower learner than he was. We were together for 3 or 4 years at the point of this anecdote, so many years ago now. I was doing the dishes, and it occurred to me that I seem to be doing the dishes rather a lot. In fact, I seem to be doing the dishes all of the time. I was the one that was doing the dishes constantly. And I said something like, I don't think it would hurt if you did the dishes occasionally. And I looked round to see what the response was, and his face went white. And he left the room. And I thought, oh God, I've done it now. And I had. And about 5 minutes later, he came back. He said, I have never, ever criticized you. And he left the room, and that was the end of that conversation. In fact, it was the end of all conversations until about 5 p.m. that evening, where normal communications resumed. I shot a hole in the bottom of the lifeboat, and this was not on, and we haven't done it since. Does this mean things can't be discussed? No, we'll come to that. But direct criticism or nastiness or attack are just out of bounds, because the vessel that is carrying the 2 of us is more important than any agenda of the individual. And the quickest way to destroy the relationship is to engage in any of those behaviors. There's a recovery writer who's not very well known, but is quoted by some people, from Minnesota. I think he was writing and working in the 70s and the 80s. I may be wrong about that, but that's approximately when he was writing. Ernie Larson, Earnie Larson. Of course, he's from Minnesota. He's called Larson. And he did a study where they identified the 7 behavior patterns which cause people to feel love. Or how do you express love? What does that actually mean? And the 7 were these. Number 1, don't attack the other person. If you want them to feel loved, don't attack them. It shouldn't need to be said, but it does. You defend them. So when attack comes from the outside, you side with them, not against them. This can happen at dinner parties where a third party or a fourth party is there, and one person sides with the visitors against the other person. I've seen that happen before. So you side with the person you're in the relationship with. Doesn't mean you have to defend the indefensible, that's different. But you side with them. You encourage them, which is straightforward. You admit them into the inner world. Not necessarily into everything, but there has to be some admission to the inner world. You treat the person as important, you accept them as they are, and you treat them as valuable. Now, this was not on fridge magnets when I was growing up. So this was actual new information to me. Tradition 1 is interesting, though. It's not about the complete sacrifice of the individuals. It's about the recognition that the vessel of the relationship is what is carrying the individuals. So the unity must always come first. But as it says in the 12 and 12, personal welfare comes second. And the questions that we ask each other a lot are these: what can I do for you? And you've got to be you've got to be careful with the next one. What would you like me to start doing, stop doing, or do differently? What would you like me to start doing, stop doing, or do differently? And this is particularly useful if the other person is clearly upset in some way, because it gives them the you don't have to drag it out of them. If you ask them that question, they'll tell you. They really will. And those are questions we ask on a regular basis. Now, of course, you don't want to hand someone who is psychotic a blank check, but this is the point. If you're in a relationship with someone reasonable, you can ask that question safely. If it's not safe to ask that question, why are you there? I learned an interesting lesson in Al-Anon. I love Al-Anon. They teach interesting lessons that you won't hear anywhere else. I read in Making Crises Work for You, on those snappy Al-Anon titles, it said, you can't expect reason from an unreasonable person. You cannot expect logic from an illogical person. I did not know this. I thought that if you explained things carefully enough and hammered, eventually you'd extract reason from an unreasonable person. But you were. This is all predicated on finding someone else who's reasonable and working with that, rather than finding unreasonable people and then trying to train them, which is what I did when I was drinking. Tradition 2, for our group purpose, there is but one ultimate authority, a loving God as he may express himself in our group conscience. Our leaders are but trusted servants, they do not govern. So when decisions need to be made about holidays, about whether or not to have a cleaner, about when to eat dinner, about what temperature the room is, about whether the window is going to be open or shut, these Very important. People underestimate the importance in a relationship of what temperature you agree the room is going to be. It's amazing how not resolving that leads to all sorts of problems. But the point is, tradition 2, to be overt in those communications. This is concept 12 as well. Discussion, vote, and substantial unanimity. How do you have substantial unanimity between two people? You both have to agree. Now, the boss level hack for this is, what this means is that a lot of the time I just have to compromise and say that's fine, because it's the only way agreement is going to be reached. Don Pritz would say that his relationship advice was, a relationship with someone, another human being, is a lot like your relationship with God. You'll get along just fine if you memorize and repeat the phrase, often thy will be done. Now, compromise is a sort of dirty word in Al-Anon sometimes, because the trope is that when I was a child, I never had a voice, no one ever listened to me, but now I'm in recovery, everyone is going to listen to me. I was at a meeting once and everyone was saying they'd found their voice, and a lovely Glaswegian female friend of mine, she said, I found my voice when I found recovery, and I found it was a sledgehammer. So compromise can have a bad reputation. Compromise is not backsliding into codependent behavior. It's how adults operate. How important is it is one of my favorite Al-Anon slogans. Often something is important only because I've decided it's important, that I've drawn a line in the sand, so, well, this is what we're going to have the battle about. And it's not remotely important. It's only important because I've decided it's important. Concept 9 also talks about a leadership. One great leadership skill is to accept progress through an endless sequence of unsatisfactory compromises. I'm going to say it again. To seek progress through an endless sequence of unsatisfactory compromises. Each compromise looks unacceptable, but when you put the compromises in a row, you discover you've got an acceptable outcome. And with learning to live with another person, you see what I think is reasonable looks insane to him, and vice versa. My other half is ethereal and mystical and kind of, fairy-like not in the sort of pejorative sense, but in the sort of mythological sense. Whereas I'm more like a civil engineer. I mean, the relationship should not work. What I think is normal and reasonable looks insane to him, and vice versa. I'm very foursquare, he comes at things sideways. The only way we can form a relationship is if both of us compromise hugely. Now, what I feel of as great compromises to him are going to seem perfectly reasonable concessions to his way of thinking. Compromises always feel much more painful on the side that they're being made than on the side they're being received. They seem like a return to sanity to the other person, whereas to you it feels like you've given up a kidney or something. But what I've discovered with compromising on huge numbers of things, I discover I'm happy. There we go, because that's what I'm after, ultimately, at the end of the day. Also, it means that no one is in charge of anything. And I don't want to get too much into the concepts. You can apply the concepts to this. So it's as though the family unit is like a conference, and that has to come to these big decisions on large matters of general policy and finance through discussion, vote, substantial unanimity. Now, they can be in charge in this, but it's by delegation. So I'll give you an example. When it's one of my cooking nights, I'm in charge. When it's one of his cooking nights, he's in charge. But it's authority which is delegated by us who've sat down together as a family and said, right, who's in charge of what? And then that person's in charge. But neither of us have the ability to pull rank except in an emergency. So if I'm doing something incredibly dumb or dangerous, usually not looking where my elderly mother is going or what she's doing, he will pull rank. And like very occasionally I've had to pull rank on getting a passport once. But it's very, very rare. But neither of us act as though we're in charge. If anything is important, it's the group which decides. Tradition 3, the only requirement for AA membership is a desire to stop drinking. And tradition 3, in the long form and in the literature, is very interesting. It talks about no rules, no conformity. AA doesn't demand anything of me. As long as I basically will sit quietly, take my turn, not disrupt the meeting, and not do anything untoward in meetings, I can really be who I am. And applied to the relationship, we don't make demands of each other. We don't see ourselves as entitled to anything from the other person. No conformity is required. If you want to be in it and you're happy to make it and you want to make the relationship work, that's the only requirement. Desire to be in the relationship. And I got this from this Al-Anon in Texas. Tradition 3 in relationships, you must desire to be in the relationship and make it work. I've been in relationships in my drinking where I was in a relationship, but at the same time acting as a saboteur, but still looking on the surface like I wanted the relationship to work. There has to be a sincere desire to make it work and to make whatever sacrifices are necessary to make it work. To join AA, you don't have to bring anything. You don't have to pay any dues or fees. Whatever you have to bring, which is yourself, is enough. And this speaks to this topic of entitlement. There are a couple of years where my job, I mostly correct commas, whereas he does something very important. And for a couple of years, he was doing very, very important things. And, I don't know what was going on, because he never used to tell me what was going on, but I knew something was going on. Dirty work was afoot, and there were machinations and schemes and plots, and he was the object of all of this. And nasty affair, I later discovered. But for 2 years, he was preoccupied for 2 years. I'm not talking 2 evenings. For 2 years, he kind of wasn't really available. And I made the decision, my job is to be supportive of him. If he becomes available again, great. If he doesn't, that's fine. Maybe my job is just to support him. And then he became available again in all sorts of ways. There are times he's super available. There are times he's not. There are times I'm super available. There are times I just can't even. And that's okay. We're allowed not to have anything to offer on any given day. It's just like Clancy says, that at any given moment, sobriety is sufficient. Across the course of your sobriety, more than just sobriety is necessary. You're going to need to do some work and sort your crap out. And in the relationship, of course, a little more than just being present is necessary across the course of the relationship. But at any particular point in the relationship, the other person's existence is sufficient. They don't need to do anything or perform in any way at all to be totally accepted and loved. Tradition 4, each group should be autonomous except in matters affecting other groups or AA as a whole. Now, this is the absolute core of what makes it work. Each AA group is autonomous, but AA groups can get together to do things like conventions and conferences and public information and literature and intergroups and picnics and camp outs, whatever they are. But each group does what it wants. And in Star Trek, you have is it called the Prime Directive, something like that? The Prime Directive in the relationship is, I have my life, he has his life. My life is none of his business. His life is none of my business, except in as far as we want to let the other person in. But we have a common life, which is the family life. And that is both our businesses in a joint way, which means I've never looked at his phone. I've never hacked into his Facebook account. I never rifle through his papers, and vice versa. The absolute granting of confidentiality and privacy. Whatever he wants to tell me, there are things I don't know about his life from before I met him. And if he wants to tell me, he can. And if he doesn't want to, that's fine. By virtue of being in a relationship with him, I do not have possession or entitlement to anything. A friend of mine, an acquaintance of mine, says one of the most chilling notions is two people at the early stages of an intimate relationship sitting on the sofa, watching the television, and when the commercial break comes up, one of them turns the volume down, turns to the other, takes their hand and says, "No secrets, eh?" You know, we're not living in 1984 with a huge screen in the room that can see everything you're doing. Rabbi Manis Freeman, well, that was a Freudian slip. Manis Freeman talks about allowing other people to have the dignity of growing in their own way, of having character defects, which you exercise modesty in relation to. So when they're showing a character defect, you look the other way, as you would if someone you don't know were unclothed. You would look the other way, to allow someone the privacy to whatever internal world they have and however that manifests externally. And so there's autonomy. He doesn't have to run anything about his life past me, and vice versa. As a courtesy, if something in my life is going to affect him, I will ask him and secure permission. So I travel for various reasons separately than him. So we go on holiday together, but I travel for various reasons. If I have a trip planned, I'll say before I book the ticket, here are the dates I'm planning to go to so-and-so. Is this okay with you? Because it affects him, because he's doing everything on his own. I'm not going to be there for a few weeks. Similarly, if he has to make a decision which affects me, he asks me. But it's a courtesy rather than an invitation to control. So again, this works if both people are essentially respectful of the other person's private domains. So you've got two private domains and a common domain. Sometimes there is an occasional need. People talk about boundaries, and Al-Anon is a funny old place for boundaries, because as soon as a new Al-Anon member gets wind of this notion of boundaries, they speak of nothing else for about 5 years. And if ever anyone who's here is giving an Al-Anon workshop on, doesn't matter what the topic is, if you have a question and answer session, every single question is going to be the presentation of some situation about the husband or the wife or the child or the parent, about some aspect of their behavior the individual finds objectionable, disagreeable. How can I set a boundary? I want to set a boundary. And luckily, this phase eventually passes. But you have to sort of grit your teeth and bear it for a while. Now, I think boundaries are the death of a relationship. They're absolutely deadly, because what they do is they construct these sort of minefields that the other person has to tiptoe through. What we do have is this notion of the polite request. And a polite request is simply that. In the 12 and 12, in the step part of the 12 and 12, it talks about the difference between a request and a demand is plain to anyone. Now, they say that. I don't think it is plain to anyone. When I historically, when I've made a request, it comes out like a demand. A request is something which is voiced only once, and if the answer is no, you don't pull a face, sigh, or repeat the request. If you do any of those tactics, it ain't a request, it's a demand. Doesn't matter how nicely you word it and explain it, it's now a demand, because you've now told the other person to have my approval, then you're going to have to play ball. So we make polite requests, we limit ourselves. There's something that requests seem to, or certain types of requests where they involve the other person changing their behavior, they seem to exact a price which is paid by the general pool of goodwill in the relationship. If you make too many, it turns the relationship into something else, in my experience. So I'm much more ginger about making requests than I used to be. And making too many, making the same request over and over and over becomes bullying. And I've been guilty of that. And I was pulled up on that quite rightly. But again, there's a wonderful line on page 118 of the big book. Live and let live is the rule. If you both show a willingness to remedy your own defects, there will be little need to criticize each other. And I've discovered that when Jonathan leaves his lots of clothes lying around, he will eventually put them away. I don't need to remind him every 6 months. Eventually. Now, eventually, it can literally be a year, but eventually it gets put away. He's just on a different time schedule than me. That's fine. 5, each group has but one primary purpose: to carry its message to the alcoholic who still suffers. Now, what is the primary purpose of the relationship? Someone once sent us, in fact, an anniversary card. And the picture on the card was of a rowing boat seen from below the prow. And in the prow of the rowing boat were two, there was a golden Labrador and a black Labrador. And they were sitting there very proudly in the prow of this boat. And it struck me, well, this is a perfect image for the relationship. It is a vessel which carries us through life in a far more robust and reliable way than we could proceed through life under our own steam. The two dogs are able to just sail down the river as opposed to having to constantly paddle. It is the combination which gives it its strength, which is far, and so the strength it confers is far greater than the sum of its parts. A third thing is created, which is this invisible vessel, which is what is being protected. And you can't see it. Well, I know that's in the nature of invisible vessels, but it's worth repeating. The vessel of the relationship is completely invisible. You don't see it until you get through situations with ease that you would have struggled with on your own. If you sponsor men, by the time they've been in a relationship for 5, 6, 7 years, they start phoning their sponsors with a particularly whiny voice. I did. 6 or 7 years into a relationship, the romance has gone out of it. The spark has gone out of it. I just don't feel the way I used to. As though the relationship is all about the feelings that you see portrayed in cheap Netflix teen series set in some high school in Massachusetts. It's the wrong model in my experience. I made that mistake myself a few years in, thinking there was something missing. It's like complaining after you've been going to a gym for 5 years that your free pass you had for the first week is no longer valid. In my experience, all of that sort of fluttery stuff is what gets you through the door, but it's not what keeps you there. It's recognizing that this invisible fortress has been built, and that, to me, is what it's about. That's tradition 5 is building that vessel. 6, an AA group will never endorse, finance, or lend the AA name to any related facility or outside enterprise, lest problems of money, property, and prestige divert us from our primary purpose. So this is about faithfulness. I'm going to be so controversial now. Someone once gave me the advice, and I think it was good advice: one relationship at a time. Have you got that? Nod slowly if that makes sense. One relationship at a time. There we go. That will just simplify so many things. You have to have fewer changes of clothes, for one thing. You don't need to carry toiletries around in your little bag, pretending that they're for some other purpose. Anyway, faithfulness. What it means is that my energy must not be dissipated in other directions. So this is not just about having one relationship. It's about averting my mental energies from even considering other things, so that the energy is all pointed, that energy, the relevant energy, is all pointed within the relationship. The second thing as well, now AA is not without problems of money, property, and prestige, and so on. That's a sort of shorthand for the whole bucket of worldly concerns. They're not absent from AA, but they're kept in their place. So those lower order concerns, particularly money and material things, we keep them very deliberately outside our discourse. So there's all sorts of administration to running a joint household. I happen to do the bulk of the administration. And if I need to do any of that administration, which involves his consent or cooperation or something, I do it during business hours when we're both at work. I do not bring those questions and matters and things to do and lists into the evening when we're together. It's work. It's not, because it all of that material stuff, it makes people edgy. This is exactly the same in AA. As soon as you're talking about material things, it's all very nice when you're talking about God and fellowship and spiritual growth. Everyone's very happy with that. Start talking about money and property and plans and practical things, everyone gets tense. If you've ever been to a group conference or a business meeting, tense. So we keep lower order concerns out of the joint living space, as it were. He never talks about work at home. I don't talk about work at home. If we talk about stuff, we'll go on a walk and talk about it. So it doesn't come into the lounge or the bedroom. Those topics are separate, which means that when we're together, it's like being on a date for 18 years, because that other stuff is kept in its place. What else? 7, every AA group ought to be fully self-supporting, declining outside contributions. So the family is, we jointly are financially self-supporting. But in our case, because we both work, we're individually self-supporting. So to mirror tradition 4, I have my money, he has his money, and we have joint finances. What he does with his money is none of my business. What I do with my money is none of my business. As long as we can both contribute to the common pot, we're good. This saves an awful lot of arguments. It is very clear what expenditure is covered jointly and what expenditure is covered individually. Also exercising warranty 2 of concept 12, financial prudence, because I'm prudent and he's successful. This is a very good combination. It means we don't have to argue about money because we both have buffers. Um, this has made the relationship a lot easier. I was taught, this is one of the few things. Sometimes, you see, my Al-Anon spiel for years was, well, I wasn't taught anything when I was growing up. I was taught how to budget and how to be careful with money. Now, it's not an insignificant thing. I might have not been taught important things about human relationships, but budgeting I can do. um, to keep the relationship in a safe vessel, the material stuff does need to be looked after, but it needs to be looked after using the principles of the program. We're not dependent on each other as well. This is the interesting thing. We've got dependence, which is very bad. We've got so dependence is a disaster. Codependence, which is all this entanglement, is a disaster. Now, what we've got, I think, can be best described as an alliance. In an alliance, there isn't dependence. So being fully self-supporting through my own contributions spiritually means that I rely on my inner resources, which ultimately connect to a power greater than myself. Sometimes my other half is the channel for those emotional, spiritual resources, and sometimes not. But I'm not dependent on him for those. I'm dependent on my higher power. He has his own. He'd deny he has a higher power, but my sponsor thinks he's a mystic. So, you can work that one out yourself. He has inner resources, as described in the spiritual appendix 2 in the Big Book. But the interesting thing about tradition 7, for a group to function in AA, it's got to be able to survive without outside contributions. My life is viable without the relationship. His life is viable without the relationship. Our lives individually were viable without the relationship, which means the relationship was not co-opted to fill some disastrous emotional gap in either of us. So what we were bringing to the deal was we were bringing abundance to the relationship. We weren't seeking for the other person to plug a gap. More can be said about that, but that's enough on that for now. But the relationship fixes nothing. Someone said to me once, if you want a relationship, you're lacking in opportunities for forgiveness and service, because those are the two primary things that are going to happen if you get into a relationship. There's an awful lot you're going to discover you have to forgive by withdrawing your judgment of, and there are an awful lot of ways you're going to have to be of service, and it will require you to not do other things you would otherwise have done. But it's not there to fix anything. If there is anything which needs fixing, it needs to get fixed elsewhere. Or the relationship is simply a way of using the other person to do something for me that I ought to be doing for myself in combination with my higher power. Tradition 8, Alcoholics Anonymous should remain forever non-professional, but our service centers may employ special workers. The Dennis F. principle here is this, that we do what we do, we give what we give in this relationship for fun and for free, expecting nothing in return. The other idea from Tradition 8 is professional standards are not required in anything. So we count up from zero, and whatever is available is great. We're not counting down from a professional standard. And no scorekeeping, not, how many times have I done this? It's now your turn. That's what bean counters do. And for it to be a real relationship as opposed to a business transaction, there must be no keeping score. And this is one of the reasons why, I think, is what each person is bringing to the relationship. What I bring to the relationship is very, very visible to me, but will often be invisible to him. What he brings to the relationship is very visible to him, but invisible to me. invisible but enormously impactful. So I'm not qualified to be the accountant of the relationship because I can only see things truly from my point of view. So no scorekeeping. Tradition 9, AA as such ought never be organised, but we may create service boards or committees directly responsible to those they serve. And just the general principles of Tradition 9 here. Organise as much as necessary, but as little as possible. To allow flexibility. And also, Tradition 9 introduces the concept of delegation, which is actually the topic of all 12 concepts, one way or another. So we each have delegated roles within the relationship. There are things that, so I look after the finances, I look after a number of other things. Medical matters is what he does for a living, he deals with. Important questions about my mother, his common sense is several notches more acute, incisive and accurate than mine is. So he's like got these delegated roles, as I do, about what we're good at, plays to our strengths. And that's how delegation best works. Tradition 10, Alcoholics Anonymous has no opinion on outside issues, hence the AA name ought never be drawn into public controversy. So a couple of, I've touched on this a little bit already, but a number of things are none of my business. Is that famous saying, there are 3 types of business in the world. There's my business, God's business, and none of my business. What he's thinking is none of my business. If he wants to tell me, he can, but he needn't. If he makes a request, please, can you do this? I'm not entitled to know why. If he wants to know why, if he wants to tell me why, he can. Manus Friedman tells the story about a stereotypical couple, maybe an old-fashioned model, but she looks after the home. He comes home from work. He throws his coat over the banister. She says, would you mind hanging your coat up? Please, could you hang your coat up? Now, love would require him to do so because of who is asking. As soon as he asks the question, well, why do you want me to hang it up? There's no love. There's no love for the person. It's like, if you can present a strong enough case, the board will examine your proposal. No, you're in a different realm by asking why. So the answer is yes. And sometimes the reason one's curious about it, but the answer is yes before you hear the answer as to why, when the other person makes a request. What is going on inside him is his business, not mine. So no peeking and peering in any way. I first went to AA January 93, been sober since July 93. A little while after that, I started to go to Al-Anon, and there have been periods I've gone very intensively. There have been periods when I've gone not at all. But one thing I noticed, I think I was about 14 or 15 years sober, and so 13 years that I've been going to Al-Anon on and off. And I remember realizing that in Al-Anon, I'm in a room full of people who are hypervigilant, whereas in AA, I'm in a room full of people who are thinking largely of themselves. Being the Al-Anon, of course, I'm the one doing the noticing in the AA room. But that hypervigilance is, when you start noticing it, is really intrusive. It's one of the things that made the house I grew up in very difficult at times, because you felt under surveillance. Because you were under surveillance. That's why you felt it. This isn't intuition. Their literal eyes were literally looking at you, seeing what you were doing, monitoring. And so leaving people, just leave them be. My friend Anthony, his sponsor, will send him emails about him and his other half, where it's just the subject line says, leave him alone. Lots of things are none of my business. So mind my own business, keep my big fat mouth shut. I've invited him to come to AA meetings out of curiosity. He's never done so. And I asked him why once, and he said, well, that's your stuff. He doesn't need to know what's going on here, which I think is very healthy. In tradition 10 in the literature, it talks about staying out of politics and religion. So Jonathan and I do not discuss politics or religion. As King Lear says, that way madness lies. There are plenty of other people I can discuss that with, but frankly, if you've ever tried discussing politics or religion with anyone, I wouldn't bother if I just let that one go. Talk about macrame or something, much less controversial. Tradition 11, our public relations policy is based on attraction rather than promotion. We need always maintain personal anonymity at the level of press, radio, and films. This means when I have an idea, I don't need to sell it. I did not know this. A few years ago, I went on, I planned a trip to Arizona for various reasons. There was something I was going to, but I was going to take an extended period and look around and go here and go there. And I wanted him to come. So I proceeded to try and sell it. I sent him, I mean, it's so embarrassing. You know, I sent him pretty pictures of Sedona. Here's a website about Sedona. Have a look at this. He can Google. If he wants to find out about Arizona, he can spell it. It's not hard to spell. There are states which are hard. Mississippi can be hard to spell. Tennessee can be hard. Arizona, you don't need to look that one. You just tap it into Google. I did not need to sell the idea because it's manipulation. Tradition 11 says you tell people you're there. You don't make any big claims about AA. You just tell people it's there. Hey, we're here. This is what we do. If you want to call us, here is our telephone number. Bye. And that's it. No lurid campaigns. Nothing dramatic. So if I have an idea that I'd like to do something with him, whether it's a holiday or going for a walk, I just say what the idea is and let him draw his own conclusions. Gives them a lot more space, and PS, they're much more likely to say yes. So if you do want to have your own way, my experience is that if you don't sell it, they're more likely to say yes, to just buy it. As soon as you, a lot of people, he's like this. If you try and sell something, he clams up. So no manipulation at all. There's that Al-Anon, it's not an official Al-Anon slogan, but wait, why am I talking? And waste, why am I still talking? So I think connected with this is no attention. Give it a sec. There we go, okay. No attention seeking in the relationship. I'm the most frightful attention seeker. I'm like so he's basically a cat and I'm basically a dog. And we should not get on, but we do. So I just want attention, attention, attention. And I realized when he's sitting in the living room and he's reading, he does not want to be addressed. And I realized at one point, every time I went past the living room, I would look in to see if he was looking up, to see if he would give me attention. But they know when you walk past the door, whether you're looking at them or whether you're looking straight ahead. The peripheral vision is very acute. So manipulation can happen in all sorts of really subtle ways. But you've got to be aware, you've got to be present. What am I doing? And why am I doing it? And a great way of not manipulating attention in a relationship is to play a game called, you might want to write this down, it's called My Turn, Your Turn. In My Turn, Your Turn, I take my turn, and then you take your turn. And it's not my turn until you've taken your turn. How does this work in practice? If we're having a conversation, I'll say something, and then he says something, and then I say something. And if he doesn't say anything else, the conversation is over. It's now his turn. I don't keep needling until he continues. I was not aware I was doing any of this. It's been very, very slow realizing these subtle forms of manipulation. But the motto is leave them be. Tradition 12, anonymity is the spiritual foundation of all our traditions, ever reminding us to place principles before personalities. So with getting things done around the house, it doesn't matter who does it. What matters is that it gets done. And fair is not, I don't think the word fair is anywhere in the big book or anywhere in the traditions. It doesn't matter what's fair. So I don't ask myself, is it fair? If it needs doing and I see it, I do it. If I'm more observant, yeah, I'm going to do more. Well, that's the price of being observant. There we go. Because the alternative is bullying them. Because someone said to me, you're not going to change him. Any way in which he is for deep psychological reasons, which he doesn't even have access to you, let alone you. So yeah, you might as well accept them as they are, because they're not going to change, certainly not on your schedule. And also the anonymity part of this is the ultimate reliance is on God, not on the individual. What makes me comfortable in the relationship is I know if for whatever reason, because it can happen for 100 reasons, the relationship is not ended. Well, either if the relationship is ended by the death of one of us, or the relationship ends for some other reason. There are complicated reasons why even good relationships will end after many, many years. I've got comfortable with that in advance. I won't like it, but I'm comfortable with the idea. That allows me to be comfortable in the relationship and not insecure. If I'm insecure, it means I'm reliant on the relationship or the other person, not on God. And that's the ultimate message behind Tradition 12, is that my reliance is on God, not on them. So that's all I've got. Patrick, do you want to take over momentarily?
Yes, thanks.